Today is the 27th of July, and Fabio and I will be discussing the very first few steps that I have taken to audit the permissions related to CI for the operations that we allow through the UI and maybe also through the API. All right, so let's get started. Should I be sharing my screen, Fabio, just to give a context of the issue?
Okay, yeah, that's good.
All right. Okay, so in the issue when this was created, the steps that I had proposed initially, it included like identifying different pages under CI and listing operations under those, like which are inside of those pages. And the next steps kind of involve mapping the operations with the role-based permissions under each tier, then understanding and making a note of the business logic involved. So I thought maybe that to be able to do all of this, I should have probably a structure in place, like one spreadsheet where I can just keep a log of all the information that I collect. And I mean, the process that I had defined in the beginning, it was very incremental. And I'm also trying to evaluate how feasible this would be, because if I follow this, so it says at one step, it says that map it with the permissions. The other step says map with the business logic. But it might happen that while I'm looking at an operation and while I'm going and visiting the code bases, I would be uncovering different things which are related to that operation at the same time. So, I mean, doing it in steps means revisiting the same thing again and again. Anyway, I'll show you what's the initial setup that I have created. So let's say if we start with the pipeline index page. So I try to number like all the operations that I see here on this page. There might be more. And then maybe like listing those operations here and making a note of how are users able to perform those actions. Is it through UI? Is it through API? I am right now, all of these are through API, through UI, because of course I have marked them on the UI, but we can extend this list later. And then while thinking of like what are the roles that we allow today, I was able to find these in the documents. But I've also observed that I'm missing out owner here, like owners.
Yes.
Yeah. And then when it comes to owner, one thing that I have noticed is that it could be owner of an issue or an MR, and it could also be the owner of the project and owner of the group. So do you think I should like account for them separately?
We normally consider owner as a project owner.
Okay.
Within CI. Yeah, normally we take consideration project owner.
Okay.
We don't consider any other things like a merge request owner, like author, for example, or other kind of roles.
And
I'm trying to think whether we have scenarios where, so for example, for the job, we have cases where the job author is taken into consideration, but that is normally for the CI job token. So
right.
Yeah, that should be fine as well. It should be already considered.
Right. And when it comes to admin, so like, am I covering all the roles that we have currently in the spread across the architecture? So would we like consider these at the same level, or am I kind of mixing?
There is another scenario which is now taken in consideration with the job token scope, with the CI job token scope, which is an additional dimension to the roles that we have here, which is whether the user is authenticated by CI job token. So you can be a developer, but if you are authenticated via CI job token, you might get by API specifically a slightly different permission set.
Okay.
It's specifically the CI job token.
Okay.
And that only applies to private projects today.
All right. Okay. So that's
But
also come into picture.
yeah, we can see this in a separate scenario. It should not impact anything that we currently do by the UI. It will primarily impact API, a subset of operations with API.
Got it. And I mean, somewhere after you made a remark about how there was a specific action that you mentioned that it's different for archive projects. So I went ahead and I think I read through in the pipeline policies somewhere and saw that the archive projects are kind of like, for example, there's a separate condition mentioned for archive projects. So I was just wondering that should we be like looking at archive projects separately, or how can we keep like trace how it differentiates from the others?
I think it's the archive is applied to the build. I'm not sure what about archived projects. We do have like an archived rule that we use for builds specifically for jobs.
Okay.
And those are like if the job is really old, we introduce other features that weren't supported at the time. So we start to kind of archive and degenerate jobs. So when a job is archived, then we shouldn't be able to do some of the operations which are in the policy.
Okay. And does it really differ from role to role, or is it pretty much generic for?
I will need to double check that.
Okay.
Policy. Um, I'm not sure. Maybe it's not defined in the policies.
Okay.
I will need to double check in that. But basically, certain. Let's see. For example, if it's archived, we won't be able to play a job, to manually play a job, or in queue it or anything like that. Yeah, and then I think depending on the operation that you want to perform. So, for example, normally a developer will have the permission to play a job, but if the job is archived, then it won't be playable regardless of the role.
Okay. Yeah,
So it's
that
kind
makes
of
sense.
certain characteristics of the model, in this case, like the job, might disallow a specific operation in the first place.
Got it.
So it wouldn't be that it will not be playable for developers, but will be playable for admins, for example. It will just not be playable at all.
Okay, so instead of like making a note of, for example, which role could perform it, it can be just like, can it be performed kind of?
Yeah, that will be more like a business rule rather than a permission policy.
So can I cover that in the business logic here? Can I just mention that when it is archived, it couldn't be?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Great. So yeah, since we are on business logic, could you point at any some other examples where the business logic could kind of not overwhelm but influence the permission policy? I mean, any example out of these operations, if you can just
Mm,
mention.
okay, let's see, for example, run a pipeline. So yeah, what we just were talking about play manual jobs, for example, the business logic in that case will be if the job is archived for the play manual job, if the job is archived, then um, it would not be playable. And this is, I think, is the next or the number 6.
Okay. All right.
So your question
Um,
was if the business logic would overlap somehow with the roles. Um, I will need to double check all these and the code. Like I need to dig into the policy classes and see there if there is anything like that. Normally
okay.
there will be. Let me see if I can spot some examples.
Uh, just in case if I upload this on unfiltered, are policies something which are visible to outside of GitLab, or should I keep it a private video?
Yeah, we couldn't probably publish outside of GitLab. I mean, all these rules are available in our public source code.
Okay, makes sense.
And so I need to so there's some scenarios where, for example, in for the pipeline policy, if a
Mhm.
user can update the pipeline and is also the person triggering the pipeline, then we allow the user to also read the pipeline variables. But if it
Okay,
wasn't the same person that triggered the pipeline, we wouldn't do that by default.
okay,
And so there could be scenarios like this where a, a user might be entitled to do certain things, but if the if the model if, it fulfills certain conditions, like for example, the user is also the creator of the pipeline, and then we will allow the user to see some extra information than a user that wasn't the creator of the pipeline, even though might still be able to see the rest of the information of the pipeline. So certain information like to the pipeline variables might be hidden.
got it. Do you think it's a good idea to include pipeline creator here?
Um, we could, but I'm afraid that then this list will become very big.
Okay,
So I think because it's not like a list. I think it's more like a metrics where you say, okay, you can be developer, but if you also are the owner, the author of the pipeline, you can see these other things. You can be a maintainer, but if you're not the author of the pipeline, it will behave the same way, for that specific
right.
scenario.
Yeah.
So, um,
I mean, this is just a workaround because otherwise, if I create a matrix for all the operations, it would be very complicated. So I'm just trying to
Yes.
come up with a workaround that if I
Yeah.
cover those combinations somehow in this spreadsheet, if that would be doable.
Yeah. I think this could be still part of business logic. All the rules are part of the business logic.
Hmm.
The end result is basically whether it's allowed for admin, allowed for guests, and allowed for developers. Um, and I'm trying to think like what kind of format we could use. Mm. Because like even if we say run a pipeline, number 5, um, it's not that to run pipeline will be always available for maintainer or for reporter. I think sometimes it depends whether if the project, for example, is marked as being deleted, then even a maintainer will not be able to run a pipeline, for example. So
Okay,
while generally an action is allowed for a maintainer or developer, if some conditions are hit are satisfied in a specific moment, we kind of prevents in on the first place to even perform a specific action.
got it. So
And I
these
think this is
con
part of the business logic more. This is like a
yeah,
preconditions to run this is like a precondition. Then if everything is satisfied, all the preconditions are succeed, then we check whether the user role has permission to run this action. So maybe we can, yeah, can consider preconditions.
yeah. I was
So
going to ask you the same thing. So how does these conditions relate to the business logic? And so they're pretty
yeah,
much
yeah,
like very related. They are the same thing, right?
yeah, we can, we normally would see, I think it depends on the specific operation. There are like a lot of preconditions. Um, for example, to run a pipeline, a developer normally has ability to run a pipeline.
Mhm.
But if the pipeline you are trying to run is targeting a branch that you don't have permission, like for example, if you're not a maintainer, you cannot run a pipeline against master. Uh, then the developer won't be able to. Basically, this precondition are not satisfied, and we don't even check if you can run a pipeline. Uh,
Or is it not working? If the only the maintainer can run it against maintainer plus, right? Could we say maintainer
yes,
plus like then?
yes, Maintainer Plus will be able to run a pipeline on protected branches. Um, a developer won't, for example. So yeah, in reality, each of these operation would probably be a matrix on its own.
Right.
You have
Yes.
on one axis admin, guest, developer, maintainer, report, and then you have all the various preconditions.
Right. Yeah.
For example, and say, okay, if you are a maintainer, you can run pipeline on a branch and on and a protected branch as well. Um, but if you're a developer, you can run a pipeline only on certain conditions
Right.
um, or on certain type of pipeline.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that maybe we can limit the scope of this particular activity that we are doing to like a
Mhm.
very generic audit. And in case if we find like some major discrepancy or some major problem in this, then we can dig deeper into those specific operations.
Okay.
Let's say if like we are not on the same page on a certain operation, that maybe we'll want to reconsider how this whole matrix should be established for that. So
Okay. So is the goal of your exercise to eventually like improve the documentation or for example
yeah.
or okay. So user are kind of clear on what kind of
Yeah.
what kind of operation they can run.
Yes. Also, I mean, recently we've been running into some problems. Problems as in just some confusions like which role should see what on the UI. So just to make those decisions easier, I mean,
Mm,
documenting this would also help with one thing, like if we get to see all of this information together on the same page, then maybe we would be able to make more fast decisions like, okay, if this happens in this way, then maybe we should also carry this forward, carry this decision or business logic forward to this particular operation for that purpose.
yes.
And then we'll be on the same page as well, like the front end, back end, the designers.
Yeah, makes sense.
So, I mean, yeah, that's the current state of this project. I don't have more to discuss unless like you have more ideas you might have. Do you?
Um, yeah, so I think mm, try to map everything. I think could be complex. Just because of all these preconditions that will need to be evaluated. If we kind of keep some variables outside of the scope, we might not also not give like a real representation of the case,
Hmm.
because then there will always be scenarios where this doesn't match what is documented, and it's because of maybe some preconditions that we hadn't considered. Um, so I think um, yeah, it's kind of it's probably an exercise we need to do with the backend engineer as well, where we can map the policies that we have like in code with a kind of um, an hierarchy of
Hmm.
business rules and policies where we do, for example, if you can read the pipeline, you have permission to read details of a pipeline, then you also should have permission to do all this bunch of things because somehow are equivalent. Like if you can read the pipeline, you should read pipeline graph. You should read, I don't know, some other details about the pipeline, and you should get maybe some links, for example, related to that. So I'm just making it up, but like basically, currently we have, I think, a problem where our policies are also not very specific. So, for example, if you want to uh, add a pipeline variable, like we want to trigger uh, a pipeline with a variable, I think you need to have some permissions like to admin a pipeline. And, and this could be generic and also a little bit vague to say, okay, what is actually main? But maybe like something like admin a pipeline will be a permission that represent like a baseline for doing certain things with the pipeline. And then if you have permission to admin a pipeline, you automatically cascade into something more specific, like creating, like triggering a pipeline with a specific variable, or which means like a changing the behavior of a pipeline at runtime. And, and same scenarios would be with the read job. So if you can read details of a job, then we could probably cascade into to read the artifact rather than using a read job. It's a kind of very generic rule, but we can actually cascade into something very specific. And then if read job is it's not allowed for some reason, then read
Hmm.
artifact won't be allowed either. So we can probably build, rather than building maybe a matrix, will be more kind of a hierarchy of things we can do.
Right.
And so, for example, if you want to read an artifact, download, and for example, an artifact, you might need to have a permission to read the artifact. You might need to have permission, like going up the chain, right? Up the chain of the permission. So to download the artifacts, to read details about the build, to access at least like from a read perspective, to access the project, the pipeline and the project. And if you have, if somebody removes access from the project, then automatically cascades
Everything
down
comes
to
down. Yeah.
everything. Yeah. So
Right.
maybe like a hierarchical representation might be better suited for have a map of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, that will be very helpful.
It might be a very large and big map, but at least like you can understand that if one of the nodes changes because of some conditions, then everything else cascades down to basically a permission allowed or not allowed.
Right. And then, I mean, we can start off with focusing on the baseline uh, permissions that's needed to perform an operation, like you mentioned, and then mapping like what else is it going to affect and what affects that operation. So yeah, this will be very helpful. So in case if we
Yeah.
just have to introduce anything at any point of view, at any point, sorry, we just have to be aware of where in that hierarchy would that operation fall, because everything else would be taken care of.
Yes. And somehow in the code is represented this way. It's just not visually clear. But we do things like if a user can read the project, then we allow the users to also read the pipeline. If you can read the pipeline, then they can also read the build. If they can read the build, they can also download the artifacts. So it's kind of coded this way, but it's just not very visually represented, clearly represented.
Right. Because I am going ahead and opening all those files from the same repository. So for me, they all exist on the same plane.
Yeah, yeah,
Got
yeah.
it.
So maybe we could start with just to get an understanding of um, this hierarchy. We could
Uh-huh.
probably start with some basic example like view a job page, and maybe from there like trying to understand what are all the various permission checks that are involved into this operation. For example, if you click on a job number, for example, or even somebody sends you a link to a job, the first thing we check if you are a member of the project, regardless of the job or pipeline. If you are part of the project and you have permission to read the project, then we kind of go further into the permission checks. But if this condition fails, then you probably see a 404 page directly.
Got it.
Um, and then we check on like a more kind of more detailed conditions.
Got it. Okay, that's a good idea. So I have to get to some like I totally have to flip this whole structure and come up with a new one. And once I do that, I will share it with you again. And yeah, so let's see how we can take it from there. This was very helpful. Thank you so much, Fabio.
No problem, no problem. Yeah, anytime we can discuss and uh, yeah, if you come up with any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to do that, and I've been doing that. You know that.
Okay,
All right.
that's good.
Uh, so thank you so much. I'll upload this on Unfiltered and share it with the team as well, so they also
Okay,
have a context of what's happening. Yeah.
okay,
Thanks.
sounds good.
Have a good day.
Have a good day. Bye bye.